An 8-year-old boy stood halfway out of his seat in a crowded diner, pointing across the room at a small girl sitting completely alone with an empty plate in front of her, and asked in a voice loud enough for every table to hear, "Dad, can she eat with us?" And the way his father answered that question would leave the entire restaurant in stunned silence by the time breakfast ended. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Inspire, because this story is about to remind you that sometimes the wisest voice in the room belongs to the smallest person in it. The father was Fitzgerald Okonjo, 37 years old, a single dad raising his son Percival alone in a modest apartment above a hardware store, ever since his wife had left 3 years earlier, unable, as she'd put it in her final conversation with him, to handle the weight of a marriage anymore. Fitzgerald worked long shifts as a warehouse supervisor, and Saturday mornings had become the one unshakable ritual he and Percival protected fiercely against everything else life threw at them: breakfast at a modest neighborhood diner called the Copper Kettle, a place with mismatched chairs and a waitress who'd known Percival since he was still small enough to need a booster seat. Percival was an unusually perceptive child, the kind of boy who asked questions most adults had long since trained themselves to stop asking, and that particular Saturday, bright sunlight pouring through the diner's wide front windows, he noticed the girl sitting alone in the booth across from them almost the moment they walked in. Her name was Theodora Quince, though nobody in the diner knew that yet, a small girl who looked to be around 7 years old, wearing a thin cotton dress despite the cool morning air, sitting with an empty plate pushed slightly away from her, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching every table around her with the careful stillness of a child who had learned not to draw attention to herself. She wasn't eating. She wasn't waiting for food. She was simply sitting, present but somehow trying to take up as little space as possible, and Percival watched her for several long minutes before finally turning to his father and asking the question that would set the entire morning in motion. Fitzgerald followed his son's gaze, and something in his chest tightened immediately, the particular ache of a parent recognizing a child in quiet distress. He caught the eye of their regular waitress, Hyacinth, a woman in her 50s who'd worked at the Copper Kettle longer than most of the regulars had been alive, and asked quietly what she knew about the girl. Hyacinth's expression grew troubled as she explained that the child had come in nearly an hour earlier with a man who'd ordered her nothing, telling her to sit there and wait, before stepping outside to take a phone call and never returning. Hyacinth had checked twice already, and the girl had simply said, each time, that she wasn't hungry, that she was fine, that she didn't want anyone going to any trouble on her account. Fitzgerald felt the weight of that phrase settle heavily into his chest, the words, "didn't want anyone going to any trouble," landing with particular force in a man who had spent 3 years teaching his own son that needing help was never, under any circumstances, something to apologize for. He didn't deliberate long. He stood from their table, walked across the diner, and crouched down beside Theodora's booth so that he was speaking to her at eye level rather than looming over her, asking gently whether she'd like to come sit with him and his son for breakfast while they figured out what had happened to the men who'd brought her in. Theodora studied him for a long moment with the particular caution of a child who had learned, likely through hard experience, to be careful around unfamiliar adults. But something about his stillness, his patience, the fact that he'd asked rather than simply taken her by the hand, seemed to ease her guardedness by a fraction. She nodded, barely, and Fitzgerald walked with her back to their table, where Percival immediately slid over to make room, beaming with the uncomplicated joy of a child whose simple request had actually worked exactly as he'd hoped. Fitzgerald ordered her a full breakfast without asking what she wanted, guessing correctly that a child in her situation might be too anxious to make choices, and quietly told Hyacinth to add it to his own check without any fuss. He watched as Theodora ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger she seemed embarrassed by the careful eating of a child who wasn't entirely sure when her next real meal might arrive. Percival chattered beside her the entire time, asking about her favorite animal, whether she'd ever built a blanket fort, whether she thought thunderstorms were exciting or scary, and gradually, Theodora's shoulders began to lower from around her ears, her one-word answers slowly stretching into full sentences, until a small, surprised laugh finally escaped her when Percival insisted, with total seriousness, that pancakes were secretly just morning cake, and adults simply refused to call it what it was. Nearly 90 minutes passed before anyone came looking for her, and it wasn't the men who'd left her there. It was a woman, breathless and pale, bursting through the diner door with open panic on her face, scanning the room until her eyes landed on the booth now occupied by 2 additional people. Her name was Cassandra Quince, Theodora's aunt, and she rushed over immediately, apologizing over and over, explaining in halting, exhausted sentences that she had gained emergency custody of Theodora only 3 weeks earlier after her sister, Theodora's mother, had been arrested, and that the man who'd left her at the diner was Cassandra's own boyfriend, who'd promised to watch Theodora for an hour while Cassandra dealt with a work emergency, only to apparently abandon that responsibility entirely and vanish along with his phone turned off. Fitzgerald listened without judgment, recognizing immediately the raw, cornered exhaustion in Cassandra's voice, the specific strain of someone trying desperately to hold together a life that had fractured faster than she could repair it. He told her gently that Theodora had been completely safe, that she and Percival had gotten along beautifully, and that there was nothing to apologize for regarding a situation clearly not of her making. Cassandra's eyes filled with tears of relief and depletion combined, and she admitted, voice cracking, that she'd been barely holding on for 3 weeks, juggling a new job, a sudden child she loved but had never expected to raise, and a boyfriend she was quickly realizing she couldn't rely on for anything that actually mattered. If this story is touching your heart right now, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because what happens next reminds us that choosing to help a stranger sometimes means choosing to help their whole fragile world. Fitzgerald, listening to the full weight of what Cassandra was carrying alone, felt something shift inside him, the same instinct that had pulled him across the diner floor now pushing him towards something larger than a single breakfast. He offered, carefully and without pressure, to help however he reasonably could, mentioning that the warehouse where he worked was often hiring for reliable positions with predictable shift schedules that might actually work better for a suddenly single caregiver than whatever chaos she was currently navigating. He also mentioned a woman from his apartment building, a retired teacher named Ottilie who occasionally watched neighborhood children for modest pay, someone he trusted completely and who lived close enough to make emergencies far less catastrophic. Cassandra, initially too proud and too wary to accept help from a stranger, found she simply couldn't refuse the quiet, unforced sincerity behind the offer, especially watching how naturally Theodora had already softened after a single shared meal with people who asked nothing of her in return. Over the following weeks, what began as one Saturday morning of unplanned kindness slowly grew into something neither Fitzgerald nor Cassandra had anticipated. He introduced her to his shift supervisor, who did have an opening with stable, predictable hours in the receiving department. He connected her with Ottilie, who welcomed Theodora into her small after-school arrangement with the same unhurried warmth Fitzgerald himself had shown that first morning. Percival and Theodora, meanwhile, continued their friendship well beyond that single breakfast, their Saturday mornings expanding to include her permanently, an extra chair pulled up to their usual booth becoming simply how things were done from that point forward. Fitzgerald never once treated any of it as charity, careful in every interaction to preserve Cassandra's dignity, understanding intimately, from his own years of rebuilding a life after his marriage ended, exactly how quickly assistance can curdle into something that feels like pity rather than partnership. He simply kept showing up, checking in without hovering, offering practical connections rather than handouts, treating Cassandra as a capable woman navigating an unusually hard season rather than someone who needed rescuing. Slowly, her circumstances steadied, dependable income, trustworthy childcare, and eventually, breathing room enough to consider pursuing legal guardianship of Theodora on more permanent footing rather than living week to week in uncertainty. Before this story ends, if it moved you even a little, please comment the word kindness below, because sometimes an entire fractured family finds its footing again simply because one child noticed what the adults around him had trained themselves to overlook. Nearly a year later, Cassandra was granted full legal guardianship of Theodora, the two of them settling permanently into a small apartment just 4 blocks from Fitzgerald and Percival, close enough that Saturday breakfasts at the Copper Kettle became an unbreakable weekly tradition shared by all 4 of them, an extra chair no longer even a question but simply part of the table. Cassandra, having weathered the hardest stretch of her adult life with unexpected support from a stranger who had refused to look away, eventually enrolled in night classes toward a degree in early childhood education, inspired directly by watching how one small act of attention had changed the entire trajectory of her niece's sense of safety in the world. Fitzgerald often thought back to that ordinary Saturday morning, to the 4 simple words his son had asked without a shred of hesitation, and reflected that Percival, at 8 years old, had understood something it had taken him far longer to fully learn himself, that noticing someone's quiet suffering, and choosing to act on it without weighing the inconvenience first, remains one of the most powerful things a person of any age can offer another human being. What began with a boy pointing across a diner and asking a simple question became, within a single year, proof that kindness rarely reveals the full size of what it built until long after the moment it was first offered.